Hey guys, tonight we begin with a journey into the quiet, frozen heart of the North. Before we start, I want you to take a second to just settle in. Dim the lights, pull up the covers, and maybe find that one cool spot on the pillow. We're going to be here for a very long time, drifting through the biting winds and the dim, smoky longhouses of the Viking Age. It's a story of survival, sure, but mostly a story of sitting in the dark, smelling like a wet sheep, and waiting for a son that decided to take a 4-month vacation. So, let us just relax and float back to a time where the only thing thinner than the ice was the patience of a Norseman trapped indoors with his entire extended family. The Vikings are usually marketed to us as these shouting warriors who spent every waking second swinging axes and looking ruggedly handsome in the rain. But the reality of their lives was much, much slower. For about half the year, being a Viking didn't involve any raiding at all. Instead, it involved staring at a peat fire and wondering if you'd ever feel your toes again. When the Arctic winter rolled in, the world didn't just get cold. It turned into a monochromatic void. We're talking about the little Ice Age precursors, where the Scandinavian winter was a relentless, crushing weight. If you were a Norse farmer in, say, the year 900, your entire existence was a desperate race to stack enough dried fish and firewood to last until April. And because why not double down on the misery? You also had to share your living room with your cows. The architecture of survival was the Longhouse, a building that was essentially a giant, upturned boat made of wood, turf, and questionable structural integrity. It was designed to keep the heat in, which also meant it kept everything else in. Imagine a space about 100 feet long, windowless, and filled with the haze of a central hearth that didn't have a chimney, just a hole in the roof called lura. The smoke didn't so much exit as it did loiter, coating everything in a fine layer of soot and giving everyone a chronic phlegmy cough that they just accepted as part of their personality. Along the walls were raised wooden platforms where everyone sat, ate, and slept. It was cozy in the same way a crowded elevator is cozy. If the elevator also contained several goats and a pile of fermenting shark meat, the social dynamics of these winters were, frankly, a nightmare for anyone who values personal space. You lived with your spouse, your children, your aging parents, your thralls, and any distant cousin who happened to be passing through when the first snow hit. There was no going for a walk to clear your head unless you wanted to become a human popsicle within 20 minutes. So, you sat. You carved bone. You spun wool. You listened to your uncle tell the same story about a giant for the 400th time. The Vikings dealt with this sensory deprivation by leaning heavily into storytelling, which is how we got the sagas mostly. Because when you re-trapped in a dark room for months, you either become a world-class poet or you lose your mind. Usually both. Let's float over to the fashion of the frieze, which was less leather-clad biker and more human onion. If you weren't wearing wool, you were basically dead. The Vikings used a specific type of sheep called the Vikings, which had a double-layered fleece, a soft, insulating inner layer, and a coarse, water-resistant outer layer. They didn't just wear sweaters. They wore heavy, felted tunics that had been boiled to make them windproof. Underneath, they had linen shifts, which were great until they got damp from sweat, at which point they became cold, clingy reminders of your own mortality. They also had a peculiar fondness for leg wraps, long strips of wool wound tightly from the ankle to the knee. It wasn't a fashion statement. It was a desperate attempt to keep the blood flowing while standing on a floor made of packed dirt and frozen rushes. Food was another exercise in endurance. There was no fresh produce. Everything was preserved, which is a polite way of saying it was either salted into leather, dried until it was structural, or buried in a hole to ferment. They had a real talent for making things taste like a basement. Sour milk, stored in large vats until it turned into a sort of acidic whey called hrun, was a staple. They drank it because the water was often frozen or contaminated, and the alcohol, while plentiful in the form of ale and mead, was saved for when you really needed to forget that you hadn't seen a vegetable in 12 weeks. The sheer monotony of the diet was enough to make anyone irritable. You woke up, you ate some porridge that tasted like wood chips. You chewed on some dried cod that had the texture of a shingle, and you went back to staring at the fire. It was a slow, rhythmic grind, A quiet battle against the stillness of the north. Chapter 2. The architecture of the huddled, the structural integrity of a Viking home was less about aesthetics and more about not dying. When the permafrost set in, the walls of these longhouses were often reinforced with thick layers of turf. If you looked at a Viking settlement from a distance in February, it wouldn't look like a village. It would look like a series of grassy mounds breathing smoke into the gray sky. These turf walls could be several feet thick, providing an incredible amount of insulation, but they also had the tendency to harbor all sorts of interesting insects that would wake up and join the party whenever the hearth got particularly warm. It was a biological exchange program. You gave the beetles warmth, and they gave you something to look at while you tried to remember what the color green looked like. Inside the longhouse, the hearth was the undisputed king. It was the only source of light and heat, a long, rectangular pit filled with burning peat or wood. Peat, for those who haven't had the pleasure, is essentially compressed bog moss. It burns slow, it burns hot, and it smells like the earth is having a very smoky existential crisis, because wood was often scarce in places like Iceland or the treeless coasts of Norway. Peat was the lifeblood of the winter. Someone, usually the person lowest on the social ladder, had the unenviable job of keeping that fire alive 24 hours a day. If the fire went out, the temperature dropped to meet locker levels within the hour. The central hall was divided into functional zones, though functional is a generous term for a room where people are sleeping 3 feet away from where a pig is being butchered. The benches, or pala, served as everything: sofas, beds, and workbenches. To make them slightly less punishing on the spine, they were covered in furzbear, wolf, or if you were particularly wealthy, imported reindeer skins. But even with the furs, the dampness was inescapable. The transition from the frozen exterior to the humid, smoky interior created a constant layer of condensation on every surface. Your clothes were always slightly tacky. Your hair was always a bit limp. It was a world of permanent bad hair days and the lingering scent of wood smoke and old grease. And then there were the animals. In the coldest months, the cattle and sheep were brought into one end of the longhouse. This wasn't because the Vikings were particularly sentimental about their cows. It was a cold, hard calculation. A cow is a 4-light space heater. By keeping the livestock inside, their body heat helped raise the internal temperature of the building by a few crucial degrees. Of course, the trade-off was that you were now living in a barn. The sounds of lowing, the rustle of straw, and the very specific olfactory bouquet of a dozen cows were the background noise of the Viking winter. It is hard to maintain an aura of terrifying warrior mystique when you're stepping over manure to get to your breakfast. But the Vikings were practical people. They chose the smell of a stable over the stillness of the grave every single time. Chapter 3. The monotony of the loom and bone by the time January rolled around. The novelty of being trapped indoors had long since worn off, replaced by a sort of heavy, rhythmic boredom that defined the Norse winter. If you weren't the one tending the fire or trying to soothe the restless cow, you were likely engaged in the endless, repetitive labor of textile production. For the women of the household, winter was less a season of rest and more an Olympic marathon of wool processing. It began with the raw fleece, which smelled exactly how you demarging a damp, unwashed sheep would smell after living in a muddy pen. This wool had to be picked clean of debris, combed, and then spun into yarn using a drop spindle. There was no sitting back in a recliner here. The spinning was done standing or sitting upright, hour after hour, until the repetitive motion became a kind of trance. The sound of the spindle whirl tapping against the wooden floor was the metronome of the longhouse. Once the yarn was ready, it went to the warp-weighted loom. A massive, vertical wooden frame leaned against the wall. To keep the threads taut, they tied heavy stones or clay weights to the bottom. If you've ever wondered why Viking clothing looked so sturdy, it is because it was woven by people who had nothing but time and a lingering sense of quiet desperation. They would stand at these looms for the entire span of daylight. In the depths of winter was about 4 hours of murky twilight tend, continued by the flickering, greasy light of a blubber lamp. Let's float over to what the men were doing while the loom was clacking away. Since they couldn't go out and do Viking things like raiding or farming, they turned into obsessive wood. Every surface in a longhouse that could be carved was carved. They spent months whittling intricate, swirling patterns into spoon handles, bedposts, and chests. It wasn't just for art. It was a way to keep the hands moving, so the mind wouldn't wander too far into the bleakness outside. They also made gaming pieces out of whalebone or walrus ivory for a game called Hennef. It was a strategy game, a bit like chess, but more lopsided. One player was surrounded and had to escape. It was a very fitting game for people who were literally surrounded by walls of ice and trying to figure out how to escape the winter without losing their sanity. Chapter 4. The culinary despair of the midwinter as the winter solstice passed. The food situation shifted from predictable to genuinely concerning. The Vikings were masters of preservation, but even the best salted meat starts to lose its charm after the third month. One of the primary staples was skyr, which is still popular today, but back then it was often stored in large wooden tubs where it would naturally ferment and sour. It served as a vital source of protein, but by February, it probably had a temps that could melt paint. Then there was the bread. Because ovens were rare, they mostly ate flatbreads cooked on a griddle over the open fire. The flour was often stretched with ground-up tree bark or husks when the grain ran low, resulting in a loaf that was about as fluffy as a roof shingle and roughly as easy to chew. Because fresh water was a frozen solid or a muddy sludge, everyone from the toddlers to the elderly drank weak ale. It was safer than the water and provided some much-needed calories, though it meant the entire household was perpetually living in a mild, hazy fog of low-grade intoxication. This probably helped with the aforementioned uncle and his giant stories. When they did have meat, it was usually boiled in a massive soapstone pot hanging over the hearth. They didn't waste anything. A pig's head, the hooves of a sheep. The internal organs, everything went into the pot to create a perpetual stew that was topped up daily. It was a thick, gray broth that tasted of salt and survival. There was an ironic contrast in their winter feasts. Like Yule, they would slaughter a hog in a frantic attempt to have one last burst of fresh meat before the leanest months of March and April. They'd sit in the smoke, faces slick with grease, toasted with mead, and pretending for a night that they weren't one bad blizzard away from eating their leather boots. Of course, they doubled down on the irony by decorating the hall with evergreens, reminders of a world that was actually green. While they sat in a world that was strictly shades of charcoal and ash, they were experts at making the best of a miserable situation. Mostly because the alternative was simply lying down in a snowdrift and calling it a day. The winter didn't just affect their stomachs, it settled into their bones. Joint pain and respiratory issues were the hidden companions of every Norseman. The combination of the damp cold and the constant soot from the hearth meant that by the time the first thaw arrived, the entire village was hobbling around, coughing and blinking at the sunlight like confused owls. But for now, they stayed by the fire. The spindle kept spinning, the bone carvings grew more intricate, and the long, slow silence of the north continued to hum in their ears. Chapter 5. The spirits in the rafters, when the world outside is nothing but a screaming white void. The boundary between the physical and the spiritual starts to get a bit fuzzy. For the Vikings, the winter wasn't just a weather event. It was an invasion of the Jotun, the frost giants, who were constantly trying to snuff out the light of the world. Because why wouldn't they be? If you're trapped in a longhouse for 4 months, you're naturally going to assume the universe is out to get you. This led to a very specific kind of cabin fever that the Norse channeled into a complex world of household spirits. They believed that every farm had a landvater, or land spirit, and if you didn't treat it with enough respect, say, by being too loud or forgetting to leave out a bit of might decide to make your winter even more miserable than it already was. This was the era of the hidden people. They didn't just tell stories about gods like Odin or Thor. They told stories about the things living in the shadows of the rafters. There were tales of Draugr, which were essentially Viking zombies, the restless dead who would come back to their old homes during the winter because they missed the warmth of the fire. Imagine sitting there, trying to enjoy your sour milk, and having to worry about your great-uncle returning from the grave just to sit awkwardly in the corner. To prevent this, Tay practiced dorumins and specific burial rites involving which were holes cut in the wall for the body to be removed, then immediately sealed up so the spirit couldn't find its way back in. It was a very practical, if slightly paranoid, approach to interior design. The stories themselves were the primary form of entertainment. They weren't just told, they were performed. A skilled storyteller, or skald, could stretch a single legend over the course of a week. They used Kenning's metaphorical phrases to describe the world. The sea wasn't just the sea, it was the Wela Road. Gold was Sif's hair. It made the language as layered and dense as the turf walls protecting them. They would lean into the irony of their situation, telling epitales of heroes traveling to sun-drenched lands, while they themselves were huddled under a pile of smelly furs, listening to the wind try to rip the roof off. It was a way of mentally traveling when their bodies were physically anchored to a wooden bench. Chapter 6. Moss. Grease. And medieval medicine, of course. Living in a smoke-filled, damp, and crowded room led to all sorts of winter ailments, which the Vikings treated with a mix of genuine herbal knowledge and what we might call hopeful guessing. By February, everyone had a persistent, rattling cough from the hearth smoke. Their solution, usually a concoction of boiled leeks or garlic. They believed that if you ate enough garlic, and the smell didn't kill the illness, it would at least keep everyone else far enough away from you that the germs couldn't spread. It was an early form of social distancing, albeit a very pungent one. If you developed a winter fever, the remedies got a bit more creative. They used a lot of sphagnum, which is naturally antiseptic. They'd pack it into wounds or use it as a poultice, which was actually quite effective, though it did mean you spent the winter smelling like a swamp. For joint pain, which everyone had because, again, they were sleeping on damp wood. In a sub-zero climate, they used bear grease. They'd rub the rendered fat of a bear into their knees and shoulders, hoping the strength of the animal would somehow seep through their pores. Mostly, it just made them very slippery and even more flammable when they sat near the fire. There was also the issue of eye rot. Between the constant smoke and the dim light from the blubber lamps, everyone's vision suffered. They'd use honey as an eye salve, which sounds incredibly sticky and unpleasant, but honey actually has antibacterial properties. Still, the image of a Viking warrior sitting by the fire with honey-smeared eyes, smelling like garlic and bear grease, is a far cry from the posters you see in museums. They were less conquerors of the world, and more curators of their own physical decay. Chapter 7. The sound of the shattering world by early March. The silence of the north begins to change. It's not a sudden shift, but a slow, tectonic groaning. After months of the world being muffled by snow, the first sign of spring is ENT. Flower, or a bird it. As the sound of the ice breaking, the Vikings called this the Great Thaw, though in reality, it was less of a gentle melting and more of a violent, messy disintegration. In the forts, the thick sheets of ice that had served as highways for sledges would begin to crack with a sound like a distant cannon. This was the signal that the isolation was ending, but it was also the most dangerous time of the year. The ice was no longer solid enough to walk on, but the water wasn't clear enough for boats. You were, quite literally, stuck in limbo. Inside the Longhouse, the atmosphere shifted from quietly depressed to frenetically exhausted. This was the period when the last of the food stores were being scraped from the bottom of the barrels. The irony of the Viking spring is that it was actually hungrier than the winter. During the winter, you had your stockpiles. By spring, you were eating the seeds you were supposed to be planting. Every person in the household was likely sporting a winter beard that had become a structural part of their face, and the smell inside the house, a combination of 6 months of unwashed wool, damp dog, and fermented fish had reached a peak that would probably be classified as a biohazard. By modern standard, the thawing out process was as much psychological as it was physical. As the light returned, staying longer and longer each day, the Norsemen had to deal with the reality of what the winter had done to their property. The turf walls would start to sag and leak as the frost inside them melted. The floor, which was just packed earth, would turn into a shallow swamp of mud and rushes. You spent your days stepping through a slurry of meltwater and animal waste, waiting for the ground to dry out enough to actually do something. It was a time of immense irritability. The Vikings had a word for this kind of late winter: restlessness, or short day mood. It was essentially seasonal affective disorder, but with more axes. Chapter 8. The Great Airing and the Return of the Sun. When the temperature finally crawled above freezing for more than a few hours a day, the first order of business was the Great Airing. This was a ritual of survival. Every single item in the Longhouse, the furs, the tapestries, the woolen blankets, the straw bedding was dragged outside and draped over fences or rocks. The goal was to let the wind and the weak Arctic sun kill the dampness and the lice that had spent the winter feasting on the inhabitants. Seeing a Viking village in late March would have looked like a giant's laundry day, with miles of gray and brown wool fluttering in the breeze. The return of the sun was celebrated with the Sigurblot, the victory sacrifice. But despite the name, it wasn't a celebration of a military win. It was a celebration of having not died in the dark. They sacrificed to Odin for luck in the coming season, but they were mostly just relieved to be able to stand outside without their breath freezing to their eyelashes. The men began the grueling task of repairing the ships. The cows, thin and staggering from their months of indoor confinement, were led blinking into the pale sunlight. Some of them were so weak they had to be carried to the pastures. It was a pathetic sight. The mighty Norsemen, carrying their emaciated cows, like oversized toddlers, but it was the reality of the subsistence cycle. Life was returning, but it was fragile. The transition from the endless winter to the raiding season wasn't a leap. It was a slow, muddy crawl. But as the first green shoots of hardy grass appeared through the slush, the heavy, sleepy weight of the winter monologue finally began to lift. The Vikings had survived another dark cycle, not through heroics, but through the sheer stubborn ability to sit in a smoky room and wait. The world was waking up. The Whale Road was opening, and for the first time in half a year, someone could finally open a door and leave it open. Chapter 9. The slow creak of the longship, as the slush finally turned to actual water and the mud gained enough structural integrity to support a man's weight. The focus shifted toward the shore in the Viking world. The arrival of spring was unmarked by the chirping of birds, partly because the birds were just as cold and annoyed as everyone else, but by the smell of boiling tar. If the winter was the season of smoke and wool, the spring was the season of resin and labor. The longships, which had been resting under timber sheds or piles of brush, had to be inspected for the damage caused by the deep freeze. Wood is a living thing, and in the extreme cold, it contracts. The iron rivets might have loosened, and the woolen tar caulking in the seams often became brittle and flaked away like old scabs. The process of re-waterproofing a ship was a slow, meditative task that could take weeks. Men would crouch under the holes, scraping away the old, failed sealant and pressing in fresh hair caulking, literally a rope made of sheep-s wool or horsehair soaked in pine pitch. It was sticky, it was tedious, and it was the only thing standing between them and a very cold death in the North Sea. There's a certain irony in the fact that the terror of the medieval world, the fury of the Northmen, began with a group of tired farmers meticulously stuffing goat hair into cracks in a piece of oak. While the men were busy playing with tar, the women were finalizing the most important piece of technology for the upcoming voyages. The sail. A single Viking sail could take years to produce. It was made of vadimela, heavy, water-resistant wool, and it required the fleece of about 200 sheep. Over the winter, they had woven it in narrow strips, and now, in the increasing light of spring, those strips had to be sewn together with heavy linen thread to keep the sail from stretching and losing its shape in the salt spray. They treated it with a mixture of animal fat, ochre, and sometimes even horse blood. This gave the sails their iconic dark red color. But it also meant that a Viking fleet didn't just look intimidating. It smelled like a floating butcher shop. The first launch of the year was never a grand, cinematic event. It was a muddy, straining ordeal. They used rolling logs to move the ships from their sheds to the water, a process that involved a lot of rhythmic grunting and the occasional crushed toe. When the hull finally hit the water, they didn't immediately set sail for Paris or London. They waited. They let the ship sit in the fjord for a few days so the wood could swell. The dry planks would soak up the water, expanding against the rivets and making the ship truly watertight. It was a period of quiet observation, watching the bilge to see if the North Atlantic was going to stay on the outside where it belonged. Let's float over to the supplies for these first voyages. They weren't packing fresh fruit and wine. The spring rations were the leftovers of the winter. Bags of hard, tooth-shattering hardtack crackers, barrels of salted herring that had turned a slightly concerning shade of yellow, and skins of that sour fermented whey. They were trading one kind of monotony for another. Instead of staring at a peat fire, they would soon be staring at the horizon, sitting on their sea chests, and rowing in a rhythmic, soul-crushing cadence for 16 hours a day. The winter had been a test of patience. The spring was a test of endurance. But as the first sail was hoisted and the wind caught that heavy, blood-red wool, the long sleep was officially over. The Vikings were no longer just people huddled in the dark. They were, once again, the ghosts of the whale. Chapter 10. The awkward first hello when the first Viking ships finally creaked out of the fjords. More often than not, the first voyages of the spring were about seeing who else had survived the winter. It was a period of tentative re-engagement, which is a fancy way of saying they sailed to the next trading post to see if their neighbors were still alive or if they had any grain left to swap for some very old, very salty fish. These early spring markets, like the one at Hiddeby or Kupang, were less like bustling bazaars and more like a collection of very cold, very damp people standing in the mud, trying to remember how to socialize. The irony of these encounters was that everyone was essentially in the same state of physical ruin. You'd have a group of Norse traders arriving from the west, and a group of Swedish merchants coming from the east, and both sides would spend the first hour just blinking at each other through bloodshot eyes and coughing in unison. The trade was often a slow, sluggish affair. They'd lay out their were's tusks, bundles of furs that had definitely seen better days, and perhaps some intricate bone carvings made during those long January nights. There was no haggling with high energy. It was more of a mutual agreement that everything was a bit miserable, and a trade of some dried seal meat for a bag of questionable barley was probably the best anyone could hope for. Communication was another hurdle. After months of speaking only to your immediate family and your cow, the art of conversation had mostly withered away. The Vikings used a common tongue, Old Norse, but regional dialects had a way of drifting over the winter. You might find that your cousins from across the mountain now sounded like they were talking with a mouthful of pebbles. So, they relied on silent trade or the universal language of pointing at things and grunting until someone nodded. It was a slow, rhythmic process of re-establishing the world. They would sit around small, outdoor fires, because nobody wanted to be inside another smoky room armchair news of who had died of the winter cough, and whose roof had collapsed under the March snow. Let's float over to the concept of guest friendship during this time. There was a very strict social code in the north called Havamel, which gave instructions on how to treat a guest. It basically said that if a traveler shows up at your door, you have to give them a seat, a fire, and some dry clothes. Mostly, because if you didn't, they'd probably die on your doorstep, and then you'd have to deal with their ghost. During these first spring voyages, this hospitality was stretched to its limit. You'd have dozens of sailors appearing at a farmstead, all of them wet, all of them hungry, and all of them smelling like the inside of a whale. You'd welcome them in, offer them the last of your fermented ale, and listen to their stories until you both fell asleep sitting up. It was a communal survival strategy, a way of knitting the fractured world back together after the long, dark isolation. As the sun climbed higher and the trading posts began to empty, the ships would finally turn toward the open sea. The boring part of the year, the sitting, the carving, the waiting was over, replaced by the equally repetitive, but much saltier boredom of the ocean. But for a brief moment in the mud of the spring markets, the Viking world was a place of quiet, weary reconnect. They had endured the Arctic night, not with a roar, but with a slow, steady pulse. And as we leave them there, rowing toward a horizon that finally stays bright past dinner time, we can finally let the weight of their long winter settle over us, too. Chapter 11. The genetic masterpiece of the Habsburg jaw. Now that we've left the damp, smoky longhouses of the north, let's float south both in geography and in genetic stability. We're moving into the gilded, suffocating palaces of the Habsburgs. A family that took the idea of keeping it in the family and turned it into a multi-century endurance sport. While the Vikings were struggling to survive the cold, the Habsburgs were struggling to survive their own family reunions. You see, the Habsburgs didn't really believe in conquering through war when they could simply marry their cousins and inherit a kingdom. Their motto was basically, let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. It worked brilliantly for their landholdings, but it was a bit of a disaster for their skeletons. If you've ever looked at a portrait of a late-period Spanish Habsburg and thought they looked like a thumb that had been sat on by a very heavy horse, you aren't alone. The most famous feature of this dynasty was the Habsburg jaw, or prognathism, because they kept marrying their own relatives to ensure no outside blood took their land. They effectively created a genetic feedback loop. By the time we get to the 17th century, the family tree wasn't so much a tree as it was a very tangled, very confused bush. This resulted in a lower jaw that didn't just protrude, it practically led the way into the room. It made eating difficult, speaking a challenge, and looking dignified nearly impossible. The poster child for this biological doubling down was Charles II of Spain. Now, Charles was a man who, quite frankly, shouldn't have been able to function, let alone rule an empire. Because why not have a king whose family tree was so narrow it was practically a flagpole? His coefficient of inbreeding was actually higher than that of a child, born to 2 siblings. It was Cayed the Bewitched, but in reality, it was just the victim of 2 centuries of very poor marital choices. He didn't speak until he was 4, didn't walk until he was 8, and his jaw was so oversized that his top and bottom teeth didn't meet. This meant he couldn't chew his food properly, leading to a lifetime of chronic indigestion and a generally grumpy disposition. One can only imagine the royal dinners, with the most powerful man in the world, struggling to navigate a piece of boiled mutton. The irony here is that the Habsburgs were obsessed with their pure blood. They believed they were the pinnacle of European nobility, yet they were physically falling apart. Charles was often described as having a head that was too big for his body, and a tongue that was too big for his mouth. He drooled constantly, which the court painters tried their best to ignore. But there's only so much a soft focus brush can do for a man who looks like he's made of melting wax. He was married twice, mostly for political reasons. But since he was also chronically ill and genetically exhausted, he failed to produce an heir. This eventually led to the War of the Spanish Succession, because when a dynasty spends 300 years trying to keep its blood pure, it eventually runs out of blood altogether. Chapter 12. The daily grind of a broken king, living as Charles II, was a slow-motion tragedy of royal proportions. His daily life was a series of rituals designed to keep his fragile body from simply giving up. Because he was so weak, he spent most of his time being carried around the Escorial, a massive, gloomy palace monastery outside Madrid that felt more like a tomb than a residence. The walls were lined with portraits of his ancestors, all of whom shared his distinctive chin, staring down at him as if to say, "Yes, we did this to you, and we'd do it again for a piece of the Netherlands." His medical treatments were, as you might expect, less than helpful. The doctors of the time, convinced he was under a curse rather than a victim of a recessive gene, tried everything from holy water to placing the freshly slaughtered organs of animals on his chest to draw out the evil. It was a world of superstition and smells. Imagine being a man who already has trouble breathing because of his jaw, and now you have a warm pigeon heart taped to your ribs. It wasn't exactly a recipe for a restful afternoon. He spent his days in a state of perpetual half-bakedness, moving from one religious ceremony to another, his heavy velvet robes weighing down a body that was already struggling to stand. The court around him was equally stagnant. Because the king was so incapacitated, the real power lay with his mother, Mariana of Austria, who, coincidentally, was also his niece. The social dynamics were a nightmare of etiquette. There was a rule for everything. How many steps you could take toward the king, which hand you used to offer him a cup of water, and how long you had to wait after he drooled before you could politely look away. It was a silent, slow-moving world where nothing ever really changed. And the atmosphere was thick with the scent of incense and the sound of distant chanting. Let's float over to his hobbies, if you can call them that. Charles, who was fond of shooting, but since he could barely hold a musket, He mostly just watched others do it. He also had a strange obsession with their royal tombs. He would occasionally descend into the pantheon of the kings and have the coffins of his ancestors opened so he could look at their remains. It was a morbid, quiet pastime of man. It was the end of his line, staring at the beginning of it, perhaps wondering which one of them had passed down the gene that made it so hard for him to swallow his dinner. It was a life of quiet, gilded despair, a long, slow walk toward an inevitable extinction. Chapter 13. The golden age of the Habsburg chin. As we drift further into the history of the Habsburgs, we have to talk about the peak of their facial architecture. You see, the jaw wasn't just a biological accident to them. It became a sort of accidental trademark, like a living family crest that you couldn't put down. In the mid-16th century, Emperor Charles V was the man who really put the Habsburg in the Habsburg jaw. He was the most powerful ruler in Europe, presiding over an empire where the sun never set. Yet he spent a significant portion of his life struggling to close his mouth. He had a lower jaw that didn't just protrude. It seemed to be attempting an escape from the rest of his face. It's said that when he traveled through Spain for the first time, a peasant shouted at him, "Your Majesty, shut your mouth." The flies of this country are very insolent. This is the kind of casual, rural honesty you can only get in the 1500s. Charles, to his credit, took it with a sort of weary, noble silence mostly, because his teeth didn't meet, making a witty retort a bit of a phonetic nightmare. The irony of the situation was palpable. Here was a man who owned half the known world, yet he couldn't chew a crust of bread without significant mechanical effort. The lifestyle of these elite genetic experiments was one of extreme, sluggish formality. Because their bodies were often failing them, the Habsburgs leaned heavily into the Spanish court ceremony. This was a system of etiquette so rigid it makes a modern DMV look like a rave. Every single movement was choreographed. If the king wanted a glass of water, it had to be brought by a specific nobleman, who handed it to another nobleman, who then knelt for several minutes before finally offering it to the king. By the time the water reached the royal lip switch, again, were often a bit of a moving target. It was probably room temperature and flavored with the dust of the palace. It was a world of slow-motion histories, where the ticking of a clock was the loudest thing in the room. Chapter 14. The melancholy of the royal nursery. If we float over to the royal nurseries, the scene becomes even more subdued. The Habsburg children were the primary victims of this dynastic stubbornness. Because they were so fragile, they weren't allowed to play like normal children. They were treated like expensive glass figurines. A young Habsburg prince or princess spent their days swaddled in heavy silk and lace, surrounded by somber tutors and stern governesses who were terrified the child might catch a draft and end the family line. They were fed a diet of soft mushies not just because they were children, but because the family's dental situation made anything crunchy a genuine hazard. There was a profound, quiet sadness to these nurseries. The children were often pale, sickly, and prone to the vapors. They didn't run. Teysa fled. They didn't shout. They whispered. They were the products of a system that valued the purity of their blood over the strength of their bones. The infant mortality rate in the Habsburg family was staggeringly high, even by the standards of the time. For every Charles II who survived to adulthood, there were dozens of siblings who flickered out in infancy, their little bodies simply too tired from the genetic weight they carried. The toys they played with were equally stifling. They had silver rattles and gold-leafed rocking horses, but the joy was sucked out by the constant supervision. Imagine trying to have fun while 6 elderly men in black robes watch you to make sure your jaw doesn't lock. The irony was that while the Habsburgs were trying to breed, they were actually breeding a generation of children who were exhausted before they even reached puberty. They were sad, sickly, and spoiled, a collection of tiny, gilded tragedies waiting for their turn to sit on a throne they were too tired to hold. Chapter 15. The cabinet of dusty curiosities, when your jaw makes it hard to talk to people, and your genetic makeup makes you feel like a wilted piece of celery. You tend to find comfort in objects. The Habsburgs didn't just collect land. They were perhaps history's most dedicated hoarders of the bizarre. This was the era of the Kunstkammer, or cabinet of curiosities. Imagine a room that looks like the attic of a wizard who has lost his mind and also has an unlimited budget. They filled these rooms with everything from unicorn horns which were definitely just narwhal tusks. 2 mechanical clocks that performed tiny, depressing plays every hour on the hour.
Emperor Rudolf II was the gold medalist in this particular event. Rudolf lived in Prague, and he was, to put it gently, not a fan of people. He had the classic Habsburg melancholy as sort of deep. Spiritual blah, and he dealt with it by ignoring his empire and staring at a collection of shrunken heads and celestial globes. He was a man who would rather spend 4 hours discussing the properties of a magic stone with an alchemist than 4 minutes discussing a looming war with his generals. Because why wouldn't you favor a rock over a war? Rocks don't talk back, and they don't have chins that require special tailoring. The irony here is that while the Habsburgs were physically deteriorating, their collections were becoming the most sophisticated in the world. They were surrounded by the finest art, the rarest minerals, and the most complex machinery, all while they themselves struggled to digest a soft-boiled egg. There was a peculiar contrast between the high intellect of their collections and the low energy of their lives. Rudolf eventually became so obsessed with his treasures that he refused to leave his palace at all. He created a world of still objects where he could feel safe from the terrifying, fast-moving reality of a changing Europe. It was a slow, quiet withdrawal into a museum of his own making. Chapter 16. The Silent Meal of the Sun King's Neighbors. If we float away from the cluttered rooms of Prague and back toward the stiff formality of the Spanish court, we find that the boringness of the Habsburgs had a very specific rhythm. This was the era of the grand covert, the public dining ritual. Now, you'd think a king eating would be a private affair, but for the Habsburgs, it was a spectator sport. The king would sit alone at a massive table, while rows of courtiers watched him eat in total silence. Because of the jaw situation, this was essentially an hour of a man struggling with his food while 50 people in wigs pretended not to notice. The silence was absolute. No one was allowed to speak unless the king spoke first. And since the king usually had his mouth full of a very complicated piece of pheasant, he didn't say much. 2. The only sound was the clinking of silver and the occasional rustle of a heavy silk sleeve. It was a masterpiece of awkwardness. They were performing power by showing how much patience they had for boredom. The Habsburgs were the masters of the long pause. They would stare at a painting for 20 minutes without blinking, or sit in a carriage for hours without saying a word to their traveling companions. This commitment to the monotone life was a defense mechanism. If you don't move too fast, your joints don't ache as much. If you don't talk too much, no one notices your speech impediment. They turned their physical limitations into a style of majestic gravity. To be a Habsburg was to be a statue that occasionally had to go to the bathroom. They lived in a world of velvet, incense, and very, very slow clocks. As the dynasty began to fade, the palaces became quieter, the ceremonies became longer, and the gap between the rulers and the real world became a vast, silent canyon filled with nothing but the dust of their ancestors' portraits. Chapter 17. The king who played tag with the state. Let's float away from the heavy, jutting jaws of the Spanish court and drift north toward the chilly, windswept halls of 18th century Denmark. Here we find King Christian VII. A man who was essentially the human personification of boredom turned into a fever dream. Christian became king at the age of 16, which is a stressful age for anyone. Particular for a boy who had been raised by a tutor so strict that the poor kid was practically vibrating with anxiety. By the time he took the throne, Christian had decided that if the world was going to be a giant, formal drag, he was going to make it as weird as possible. The tone of Christian's court was one of sustained awkwardness. He didn't want to discuss tax reforms or naval treaties. He wanted to play, but not normal, kingly games like hunting or chess. No, Christian preferred to spend his afternoons leaping over the furniture and playing high-stakes games of tag with his courtiers. Imagine being a dignified diplomat, draped in medals and heavy brocade. Trying to discuss the grain trade while the King of Denmark is literally crawling between your legs or hiding under a sideboard. Lou, because why not turn the highest office in the land into a middle school recess? It was a slow-motion collapse of dignity, one somersault at a time. Christian's mental health was, to put it gently, a bit of a localized disaster. He suffered from what was likely a form of schizophrenia, but at the time, people just thought he was whimsical or difficult. He would occasionally walk through the streets of Copenhagen at night, smashing windows with a mace just to see what would happen. Then, he'd return to the palace and expect everyone to act like it was a perfectly normal Tuesday. The irony of his reign was that while he was technically an absolute monarch, he had absolutely no interest in ruling. He once said that he had been born to be a commoner, and he spent his entire life trying to prove himself right by avoiding every single responsibility that came his way. Chapter 18. The Doctor and the Queen's Silent Revolt. Because Christian was essentially a child in a man's velvet suit, a power vacuum opened up at the heart of the Danish court. And into that vacuum stepped Johann Friedrich Struensee, the king's personal physician. Now, Struensee was a man of the Enlightenment. He liked science, he liked reform, and he liked the fact that the king was too busy throwing pillows at the palace guards to notice that a doctor was suddenly running the country. Fear. This led to one of the most bizarrely quiet coups in European history. While Christian was off in a corner talking to his imaginary friends, Struensee was busy issuing over 2,000 decrees in less than 2 years.